Silence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock. It doesn't warn you that it's about to change everything. It just shows up one day, sits down between two people who used to talk, and waits. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Just sit with this for a second. Have you ever looked back over your life and realized the moment everything fell apart wasn't a fight, wasn't a betrayal, wasn't even someone walking out the door? It was the moment nobody said anything at all. Because this story isn't loud. There are no screaming matches, no broken dishes, no dramatic music swelling in the background. This story is quiet, and that's exactly why it cost so much.
I feel like this story will truly touch a woman's heart. It might feel very similar to your own story. Listen till the end, then tell me in the comments, were you right or was your partner wrong? If you enjoy real-life stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Now, without wasting any time, let's start the story.
Marcus always thought silence meant peace. He was the kind of man who believed if nobody was arguing, things were fine. He grew up in a household where men didn't explain themselves. They worked, they provided, they kept moving. Feelings were something you handled alone, preferably without bothering anyone else. At 47 years old, Marcus considered himself settled. Not happy exactly, but stable. And in his mind, stable was enough. He had been married to Denise for 12 years. 12 years of shared routines, shared bills, shared space. They knew each other's habits so well that words felt unnecessary. Or at least, that's what Marcus told himself. Denise was 39 when she found out she was pregnant. It wasn't planned, not discussed, not something they had circled on a calendar or prepared for emotionally. It arrived quietly, like a whisper that instantly changed the temperature of the room. Denise stared at the test for a long time before saying anything. Her hands trembled, not with excitement, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of what this meant. A new life, a responsibility, a future that suddenly felt very close. When she told Marcus, she watched his face carefully. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he just nodded. And that was the first silence. He said, "Okay," like she had told him the car needed gas, like this was a detail, not a turning point. Denise told herself he just needed time. Women learn early how to make excuses for men's quiet. Pregnancy changes more than a body. It changes the rhythm of a home. It brings questions to the surface that were easy to avoid before. Questions about commitment, presence, and whether love can survive stress. Denise needed reassurance, not grand gestures, just small things. A hand on her back, a question about how she was feeling, a sign that she wasn't carrying this alone. Marcus didn't notice what he wasn't giving because he was too focused on what he thought he was losing. Sleep, freedom, control. Instead of saying he was scared, he withdrew. Instead of asking questions, he avoided conversations. Instead of leaning in, he leaned away. And silence grew comfortable. There's something dangerous about comfortable silence. It feels safe, it feels calm, but underneath it, resentment stretches its legs and makes itself at home. Denise felt it first. She noticed the way Marcus stopped asking about doctor appointments, the way his hand no longer rested on her stomach at night, the way he stared at his phone instead of her. She wanted to say something, but every time she opened her mouth, doubt stepped in. What if I'm overreacting? What if I push him away? What if he already feels trapped? So she stayed quiet. Silence doesn't belong to just one person. It's a shared agreement, even when nobody talks about it. Marcus told himself Denise was emotional, that anything he said would only make things worse, that it was better to wait until things settled down. But things don't settle on their own. They sink. Weeks passed. The house felt heavier. Conversations became functional. Who's paying which bill? What's for dinner? Did you lock the door? Nothing about feelings, nothing about fear, nothing about the future. And then, one Tuesday evening, Marcus came home later than usual. Denise was in the kitchen folding baby clothes, tiny socks, tiny shirts. She had washed them twice already, not because they were dirty, but because touching them made everything feel more real. Marcus stood in the doorway longer than normal. Denise felt it before she saw it. That shift, that pause that means something is coming. She looked up and asked, "Everything okay?" Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, "I need some space." 4 words, no explanation, no plan, no timeline, just space. Denise nodded, not because she understood, but because she didn't have the strength to argue. She was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, tired in her bones. Marcus packed a small bag, not everything, just enough to feel temporary. He didn't look at her stomach, didn't touch her shoulder, didn't say goodbye. The door closed softly, and that was it. No fight, no closure, just quiet. Denise sat at the table long after he left. Her hands rested on her belly, and for the first time she cried. Not loud sobs, just tears that came steadily, like her body finally had permission. She told herself he would call. He always called. Marcus wasn't cruel. He just needed time. That night she slept on her side of the bed, leaving his untouched. The room felt too big. Marcus, meanwhile, told himself he felt relieved. No questions, no pressure, no reminders of what was coming. He stayed with his brother at first, laughed things off, said things like, "You know how pregnancy gets," as if that explained everything. But silence follows you. Late at night, when distractions fade, it creeps back in. Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering why relief felt hollow, wondering why quiet felt so loud. 3 weeks after he left, his phone buzzed. A hospital number. Denise had gone into early labor. Now, pause here, because this is one of those moments where life hands you a fork in the road. This is where a man decides who he's going to be. Marcus stared at the screen. His chest tightened. Fear rose up fast and familiar. He told himself she had doctors, family, support. He told himself he'd go tomorrow. Tomorrow is a dangerous word. He didn't go. And while Marcus sat in silence, convincing himself there was still time, Denise was learning something else entirely, something that would change the rest of her life. Because some absences don't just hurt you, they teach you how to live without someone. And once that lesson is learned, there is no unlearning it. Denise woke up in a hospital bed she hadn't expected to see so soon. The lights were too bright. The air smelled like disinfectant and urgency. Machines hummed softly, doing work her body was struggling to do on its own. She was scared, but not in the way people imagine. It wasn't the fear of labor. It wasn't even the fear of complications. It was the fear of being alone while something irreversible was happening. She kept glancing at the door, not because she thought Marcus would walk through it, but because a part of her still hoped she was wrong about him. Hope can be stubborn like that. Nurses came and went. Doctors spoke in calm voices, explaining things slowly, carefully. Denise nodded, asked questions, did everything she was supposed to do. What she didn't do was call Marcus again. She had already sent the message. She had already broken the silence. What came next would tell her everything she needed to know. Hours passed. Her phone stayed quiet. And somewhere between the third check of the heart monitor and the fourth reminder to breathe slowly, something inside Denise shifted. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. She realized something painful but powerful. If a man can leave you in silence, he can also return in silence and expect everything to be the same. And she knew, deep down, she couldn't let that happen. The baby survived. Small, fragile, early, but alive. Denise cried when she heard the first weak cry, not because of joy alone, but because she understood, in that moment, that this child would never wonder whether their mother showed up. Marcus found out the next morning. A voicemail. Brief, clinical, no emotion wrapped around the words. "The baby's here. She's stable. Don't come right now." That last sentence confused him. Don't come right now. He sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, trying to understand how he had become optional. This wasn't how he imagined things going. He told himself Denise was emotional, that she'd calm down, that once things settled, he'd go back and they'd talk. There was that word again. Tomorrow. Weeks passed. Denise brought the baby home without Marcus. She didn't change the locks. She didn't pack his things. She didn't make dramatic announcements. She simply adjusted. That's the part nobody warns you about. Women don't always leave loudly. Sometimes they just reorganize their lives quietly, and by the time you notice, there's no space left for you. Denise learned how to feed the baby alone, learned how to sleep in short stretches, learned how to function while exhausted, learned how to make decisions without asking anyone else. And every day she didn't hear from Marcus, something else hardened. Not her heart, her expectations. Marcus, meanwhile, floated. He went back to work, told people the baby came early, let them assume he was involved, let them congratulate him. He avoided Denise's name in conversation, like it might accuse him. At night, guilt visited him. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet unease that followed him from room to room. He told himself he'd show up soon, that he needed to feel ready. But readiness never came. Denise finally broke the silence 6 weeks later. Not with a phone call, with paperwork. Custody arrangements, temporary support agreements, structured, calm, efficient. No emotional language, no accusations, no begging. Marcus stared at the envelope like it was written in a foreign language. This wasn't supposed to happen. He drove to the house unannounced. Denise answered the door holding the baby, smaller than he imagined, wrapped tightly, sleeping peacefully. Marcus reached out instinctively. Denise stepped back. That movement, small, subtle, hit harder than any argument ever could. They talked, or rather, Marcus talked. He explained how overwhelmed he'd been, how scared, how he didn't know how to handle everything at once. Denise listened, patient, calm. Then she said something that would replay in Marcus's mind for years. "I needed you when you were quiet." He didn't have a response to that, because what do you say when someone names the exact moment you failed them? Denise didn't yell, she didn't cry, she just said, "I can't build a future with someone who disappears when things get heavy." Marcus promised to do better. Promises sound different when they arrive late. Denise nodded, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. He left that day realizing something terrifying. He hadn't just stepped out of his marriage, he had stepped out of a season he would never get back. Months turned into a year. Marcus saw the baby on scheduled days, short visits, awkward silences, polite conversations. He tried to be present, but presence without history feels thin. The baby knew Denise's voice, her rhythm, her comfort. Marcus was familiar, but not essential, and that realization gnawed at him. He started to regret not the leaving, but the silence. He wondered what would have happened if he had just said, "I'm scared," if he had stayed, if he had spoken. But regret doesn't rewind time. It just sits with you. Denise moved forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily. She built a life that worked, a life that didn't depend on whether someone chose to show up. Marcus watched from the outside, slowly understanding the truth no one had ever taught him. Silence isn't neutral. It's a decision, and sometimes it's the one that costs you everything. Time has a way of doing two things at once. It softens some memories and sharpens others. For Marcus, the days didn't fall apart after Denise moved on. They stacked neatly on top of each other. Work, sleep, bills, weekends that felt longer than they should. On the outside, his life looked fine. On the inside, something kept scratching at him. It was the small things that hurt the most. The way the baby reached for Denise without thinking. The way Denise already knew what each cry meant. The way Marcus had to ask, "Is she hungry?" or "Is she tired?" like a guest trying to be polite in someone else's home. He told himself this was temporary. He told himself bonding takes time. But deep down, he knew this wasn't about time. It was about absence. There's a difference between not being there yet and not being there when it mattered most. And Marcus was starting to understand that distinction far too late. One afternoon, during one of his scheduled visits, Denise mentioned something casually. She took her first steps last week. Marcus smiled automatically. "Already?" Denise nodded. "Yeah, just a few, but still." He waited for the punch in his chest to pass. "Wish you could have seen it," she added, not cruelly, just honestly. He laughed, light and hollow. "Yeah, next time." But there wouldn't be another first step. That one was gone. Later that night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment and realized something uncomfortable. Regret doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in installments. Each milestone you miss is a payment due, and silence was charging interest. Marcus tried to compensate in other ways. He bought toys, clothes, things he thought would make him feel like a good father. Denise accepted them politely, but gifts can't replace presents, and children know the difference, even before they can speak. Denise never spoke badly about Marcus. That's another thing people don't talk about. Some women don't poison the well. They just stop drawing from it. She answered questions simply. She kept boundaries firm. She didn't invite him into spaces he hadn't earned. That restraint frustrated Marcus more than anger ever could, because anger would have meant he still mattered enough to disrupt her peace. Silence, on the other hand, meant she had already adjusted. Years earlier, Marcus would have avoided this discomfort. He would have buried it under work, distractions, excuses. But something about watching his child grow from a distance changed him. It forced him to sit with his own choices. And for the first time, Marcus began to ask himself questions he had spent his whole life avoiding. Why was silence easier than honesty? Why did fear make him disappear instead of speak? And why did he only understand the value of presence once it was no longer guaranteed? He thought back to his own childhood. A father who worked constantly, a mother who carried the emotional weight of the household, a home where problems weren't discussed, they were endured. Marcus had learned early that survival meant staying quiet, but survival isn't the same as connection, and connection was what he had lost. Denise, meanwhile, was building something new, Not with another partner, but with herself. She found confidence in routines, strength in consistency, peace in knowing she could rely on her own presence. People sometimes assume women stay because they're weak. They don't see the strength it takes to leave quietly, to choose stability over familiarity. Denise wasn't bitter. She was resolved. Marcus noticed the change in her voice over time. Firmer, calmer, less hesitant. It scared him. Because it meant she no longer needed him to become who she was becoming. One evening, after a visit, Marcus lingered by his car. He wanted to say something, something meaningful, something that might bridge the gap. But old habits die hard. Silence crept back in, and Denise, sensing it, said gently, "If you have something to say, say it." That moment felt heavier than any argument they had ever avoided. Marcus swallowed. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for not being there." Denise nodded. "I know," she replied. That was it. No reassurance, no forgiveness speech, no emotional release. Just acknowledgement. And Marcus realized something devastating. Apologies don't undo absence. They just name it. Driving home that night, he laughed to himself bitterly. All those years he thought silence kept the peace. Now he saw it for what it really was, a wall, and he had built it brick by brick. There was humor in the irony, dark humor, the kind that only shows up after you've lived long enough to recognize patterns. Marcus had spent his life avoiding hard conversations, and now his life was full of consequences he couldn't talk his way out of. He tried therapy. That surprised everyone, including himself. In that quiet room, across from a stranger trained to listen, Marcus finally said the words he never said to Denise. "I didn't know how to be needed." The therapist didn't rush him, just asked, "What did you think would happen if you stayed?" Marcus thought about that. "I thought I'd fail." There it was. Fear doesn't always look like anger or control. Sometimes it looks like leaving. Denise noticed the change slowly. Marcus showed up more consistently, on time, present. He listened more than he talked. It mattered, but not in the way he hoped. It mattered in that it made him a better father moving forward. It didn't rewrite the past, and that distinction is important. Growth doesn't erase regret, it just teaches you how to live with it. One afternoon, Denise said something that surprised him. "I appreciate the effort you're making now." Marcus looked up, hopeful. "But I need you to understand," she continued, "this is about our child, not us." That clarity stung, but it was fair. Marcus finally understood something most people learn too late. Love isn't proven by what you say when things are easy. It's proven by what you do when things are heavy. And when things were heavy, he had chosen silence. That choice followed him everywhere, into empty rooms, into missed moments, into a future that looked very different from the one he once imagined. And as his child grew older, asking questions, forming attachments, building memories, Marcus began to realize that the cost of silence doesn't stop accumulating. It just changes form. And one day soon, a simple question from his child would force him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. But that moment hadn't come yet. Not quite. There's a certain age children reach when they stop accepting the world as it's presented to them and start asking questions that don't come with easy answers. Marcus wasn't ready for that age. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. One of those days that don't feel important until years later when you replay them in your mind like a warning you ignored. His child was sitting on the floor, stacking blocks with the serious concentration only children have. Marcus was watching, half smiling, thinking about how fast time was moving. Then the question came. Why don't you live with us? Simple, direct, no accusation, just curiosity. Marcus felt his throat tighten. This was the moment, the one he'd been avoiding without realizing it. He could have blamed circumstances. He could have said, adults have complicated lives. He could have brushed it off with humor, but something in him, maybe age, maybe regret, told him not to hide this time. He looked at the small face in front of him and said, because I made a mistake. Children don't always react the way adults expect. There was no gasp, no tears, just another question. What kind of mistake? Marcus exhaled slowly. I was scared, and instead of talking, I left. The child nodded, as if filing the information away. Okay, they said, and went back to stacking blocks. But Marcus couldn't go back. That question followed him home, because it forced him to say out loud what silence had hidden for years. He hadn't been pushed away. He had walked away. Denise noticed something different after that day. Marcus was quieter, not the withdrawn silence she remembered, but a reflective one. He listened deeply. He asked thoughtful questions. He showed up to school events early and stayed late. But even good change doesn't erase old wounds. Trust doesn't regenerate just because someone finally understands what they lost. Denise remained cordial, respectful, firm. She had built a life around predictability, around showing up, around being the steady one. Marcus was now reliable, but reliability after abandonment doesn't feel the same as reliability from the beginning. And that's a hard truth for many people to swallow. Marcus wanted forgiveness. Denise wanted peace. Those two desires don't always align. One evening, during a routine exchange, Marcus tried to push past the boundary. Do you think things could have been different? He asked. Denise paused. She chose her words carefully. Yes, she said, if you had stayed. That was it. No hope offered, no door reopened. Just truth. Silence filled the space again, but this time it wasn't avoidance, it was finality. Marcus realized something then. Silence isn't always the absence of words. Sometimes it's the presence of an answer you don't want. He went home and sat in the dark. No TV, no phone. Just him and the weight of his choices. He thought about how many moments he had skipped because he thought they'd repeat themselves. He thought about how many conversations he avoided because he didn't feel prepared. He thought about how often he assumed there would be another chance. Life doesn't announce the last opportunity. It lets you miss it quietly. Denise, on the other hand, had made peace with her story. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she stopped waiting for someone else to heal it. She learned something powerful through motherhood, that strength doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself again and again, especially when it's hard. Marcus watched from a distance as Denise grew into that strength. He admired it, and he mourned it, because part of him knew he had helped create it by not being there. That's another cruel twist of regret. Sometimes the best version of someone emerges after you fail them. Marcus started speaking differently to people. He warned younger men at work not to confuse silence with stability. He told them, half joking, half serious, if you don't talk, life will talk for you. They laughed, but Marcus wasn't joking. He was living proof. As years passed, Marcus became a constant presence, but never the center. He was involved, dependable, present. And still he carried a quiet grief. Not because Denise moved on emotionally, but because the version of himself that could have stayed never showed up when it mattered. One afternoon, Denise said something that surprised him. I don't regret how things turned out, she said. Marcus looked at her, startled. Really? She nodded. It taught me who I am. That statement landed harder than blame ever could, because it meant her growth didn't depend on his redemption. It existed independently. And Marcus realized something most people don't want to admit. Sometimes you don't get to be part of the happy ending. Sometimes your role is to learn too late and carry that lesson forward. Marcus began to accept that. Not happily, not easily, but honestly. He stopped imagining alternate timelines. He stopped waiting for forgiveness to feel complete. Instead, he focused on what he could still do. Be present now. Speak when it's uncomfortable. Choose connection over silence. And that choice, small as it seemed, started to ripple outward, because silence had cost him everything he thought he was protecting, and he wasn't willing to pay that price again. But the full weight of that lesson would only hit him later, on a day he didn't expect, from a voice he wasn't prepared to hear. The day Marcus truly understood the cost of his silence didn't arrive with drama. No raised voices, no accusations, no tears. It arrived quietly, like everything else in his life that mattered too late. His child was older now, old enough to observe patterns, old enough to connect dots, old enough to ask questions that weren't just curious, but personal. They were sitting together in the car after a school event, the kind Marcus made sure never to miss anymore. The radio played softly. Traffic crawled. Life moved at its ordinary pace. Then the question came, "Why did you leave Mom when I was born?" Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter. This wasn't a child's question anymore. This was a reckoning. He could feel his heart racing, not from fear of punishment, but from the fear of telling the truth. Because truth doesn't always make you look good. He considered simplifying it, softening it, blaming circumstances. But something in him refused to lie. "Because I was scared," he said, "and I didn't know how to talk about it." Silence filled the car. Not the dangerous kind this time, the processing kind. After a long moment, his child asked, "Did you stop loving her?" That question hit harder than anything Denise had ever said. Marcus swallowed. "No," he said, "I just didn't know how to stay." That answer stayed with him, because love that doesn't know how to stay still leaves damage behind. Children don't just inherit DNA, they inherit patterns, and Marcus realized in that moment that his silence hadn't just affected Denise, it had shaped the story his child would carry into adulthood. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He thought about how easily fear passes itself down when it's left unnamed, how silence becomes a legacy if nobody interrupts it. Denise had done something Marcus hadn't. She had broken the cycle. She talked to their child openly, without bitterness, without blame. She answered questions honestly, but carefully. She taught emotional language. Marcus had avoided it his whole life, and now he was racing to catch up. He started having real conversations with his child about feelings, about mistakes, about how adults don't always get it right. Those conversations were awkward. He stumbled, paused, corrected himself, but he stayed. And staying consistently slowly built something new. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a foundation for what could still grow. Denise noticed the difference, not because Marcus asked for credit, but because his child felt safer asking questions. That mattered. One evening, Denise said something Marcus never expected to hear. "I'm glad you're talking to them now." Marcus nodded. "I wish I'd learned how sooner." Denise didn't disagree. There was no need. Some truths don't require commentary. As time passed, Marcus stopped framing his regret as something to be resolved. He started treating it as something to be honored, a reminder of what happens when fear goes unspoken, a warning label on silence. He shared his story when he could. Not dramatically, not as a cautionary tale shouted from rooftops, but quietly, honestly. He told people, if you feel like leaving, talk first, even if your voice shakes. Some listened, some didn't. But Marcus knew now that silence only feels safe when you don't yet know what it costs. There was a moment, small but meaningful, that sealed this understanding for him. His child hugged him tightly after a visit, not out of obligation, not politely, but fully, and said, "I'm glad you come now." That sentence held both forgiveness and truth. It didn't erase the past, but it acknowledged the present, and Marcus understood something profound. Redemption doesn't always look like getting back what you lost. Sometimes it looks like being trusted with what remains. Denise continued living her life with quiet confidence. She didn't measure Marcus by his apologies. She measured him by his consistency. And for the first time, he was meeting that standard. Still, there were nights Marcus lay awake thinking about the version of himself that could have stayed. The man who might have been there for first steps, first words, late-night feedings. He allowed himself to mourn that man. Then he let him go. Because regret can teach you or it can trap you. Marcus chose to learn, and the lesson was simple but not easy. Silence is not strength. It's avoidance wearing a calm face, and the people who love you most are the ones who pay for it. The story didn't end with reconciliation, it ended with understanding, and sometimes that's the hardest ending to accept. But there was one final conversation, years later, that would bring everything full circle. One moment where Denise said something that reframed the entire story, and when Marcus heard it, he finally understood the true cost of silence.
If you're still listening, it means this story touched you. Please subscribe. Your support truly matters.
Years have a way of changing the shape of pain. What once felt sharp becomes dull. What once felt unbearable becomes familiar. But familiar doesn't mean gone. Marcus learned that as time moved forward and life settled into something almost peaceful. Almost. Denise had built a life that worked. Not flashy, not loud, just solid. She had routines, traditions, inside jokes with her child that Marcus was sometimes part of, but often only overheard. And every time he heard that laughter, he felt two things at once: gratitude and grief. Gratitude that his child was happy. Grief that he hadn't been there to help create that happiness from the beginning. One afternoon, long after the chaos of early years had passed, Denise asked Marcus to sit down. Not to argue, not to negotiate, just to talk. That alone made his chest tighten. They sat at the kitchen table where so much silence had once lived. Denise spoke calmly. "I want to say something I never said before." Marcus listened. "I don't hate you," she said, "and I never did." That surprised him. "I was hurt," she continued, "but what hurt the most wasn't you leaving. It was not knowing what you were thinking while I was carrying everything." Marcus felt the weight of that. Because she wasn't talking about groceries or appointments. She was talking about emotional labor. The invisible work of holding fear, hope, and responsibility at the same time. "I felt alone long before you walked out," Denise said. That sentence landed like a quiet explosion. Marcus nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I see it now." Denise wasn't looking for an apology. She had moved past that stage years ago. She was naming the truth so it could finally rest. "You weren't cruel," she said. "You were quiet, and quiet made me feel like I didn't matter." Silence again. But this time, Marcus didn't run from it. "I thought staying quiet was keeping the peace," he said. "I didn't realize it was creating distance." Denise smiled softly. Not warmly, just kindly. "That's what silence does. It feels neutral to the person using it." That was the sentence. The one that stayed with Marcus long after he left that day. Silence feels neutral to the person using it, but it's heavy for the one carrying it. Marcus realized then that Denise didn't need closure. She already had it. This conversation wasn't about reopening wounds. It was about acknowledging scars. As they stood to end the conversation, Denise said one last thing. "I don't regret our child, and I don't regret choosing stability when I had to." Marcus understood what she wasn't saying. She didn't regret leaving the door closed. Driving home, Marcus laughed quietly to himself, not because it was funny, but because life has a strange sense of irony. He had spent years afraid of saying the wrong thing, and it turned out saying nothing was worse. He started noticing how often people default to silence, at family gatherings, in marriages, in friendships. He noticed how often men especially used quiet as armor. He began speaking up in small ways, asking how people were really doing, admitting when he didn't know something, saying, "I'm scared," instead of disappearing. It didn't make life easier, but it made it honest. Denise noticed too, not because Marcus announced his growth, but because it showed up in consistency, in the way he communicated clearly, in the way he didn't avoid hard topics, in the way he stayed present even when things felt uncomfortable. Time passed. Their child grew into someone thoughtful, emotionally aware, unafraid to ask questions. That was Denise's gift, and Marcus's second chance, to support rather than escape. One evening, years later, after a long day, Marcus's child asked him something unexpected. "Do you think you'd do things differently if you could?" Marcus paused. "I don't think," he said slowly. "I know." "What would you do?" "I'd stay, even when I was scared." His child nodded. "That makes sense," they said. Simple, accepting, not dramatic. Marcus realized something then. Children don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones. Denise had given their child honesty from the beginning. Marcus had learned it the hard way. The cost of silence wasn't just a broken marriage. It was years of emotional distance that didn't need to exist. It was moments missed, not because he was forbidden, but because he chose absence. And absence, once chosen, has consequences that echo. Marcus no longer tried to rewrite the past. He honored it by changing his present. He showed up, he spoke up, he stayed. And that, slowly, became enough. But this story doesn't end with Marcus. It ends with the lesson his silence left behind. Because somewhere, right now, someone listening is standing at the edge of a conversation they don't want to have. And that moment, right before you choose quiet or courage, is where everything changes. But there's still one last piece to the story. One final reflection that brings it all together. And it's not about Marcus. It's about the people listening. If you've been listening closely, you may have noticed something. This story was never really about Marcus. It was about the moments we all recognize, but don't always admit to. The moments when silence feels easier than honesty. When walking away feels safer than staying present. When saying nothing feels like control. Most people don't leave because they don't care. They leave because they don't know how to stay when fear shows up. Marcus wasn't a villain. He was unprepared. And that distinction matters because it's where most regret is born. Somewhere along the way, many of us learned that emotions were optional. That if we worked hard, paid bills, and didn't cause trouble, we were doing enough. But emotional absence has a cost, and it's often paid by the people least equipped to name it. Denise didn't ask Marcus to be perfect. She asked him to be present. And when he wasn't, she adapted. That's what strong people do. They don't always fight, they adjust. But adjustment shouldn't be mistaken for acceptance. It's survival. There's a quiet warning in this story for anyone who thinks silence buys time. It doesn't. It just delays the bill. Marcus learned that silence isn't empty. It's full of assumptions, unanswered questions, and emotional weight someone else has to carry. And the longer it lasts, the heavier it gets. If you're listening and thinking, "I've been quiet because I don't want to make things worse," hear this clearly. Silence rarely prevents damage. It just hides it until it's permanent. Denise didn't leave Marcus because he was flawed. She left because she was alone in her fear. That's an important distinction. Loneliness inside a relationship is far more painful than loneliness alone. Marcus didn't realize that until he was standing on the outside, looking in. Regret didn't show up for him as heartbreak. It showed up as missed chances. First steps he didn't see. Late-night feedings he didn't help with. Moments that don't come back. And here's the part people don't talk about enough. You can do everything right later and still mourn what you didn't do earlier. Growth doesn't erase loss. It just gives it meaning. Denise never asked Marcus to carry her pain. She carried it herself and chose stability over hope. That choice saved her, and it taught Marcus something invaluable, that love isn't proven when things are calm, it's proven when they're heavy. This story isn't a warning about pregnancy alone. It's about any season where life demands more than you feel ready to give. Illness, grief, change, fear. Those are the moments that test presence, and silence in those moments speaks louder than words ever could. If you're listening and you recognize yourself in Marcus, this isn't condemnation, it's an invitation to speak before silence decides for you, to stay when everything in you wants to retreat, to say, "I'm scared," instead of disappearing. And if you recognize yourself in Denise, hear this. Your strength wasn't in waiting. It was in choosing yourself when silence made you invisible. Not every story ends with reconciliation. Some end with clarity. And clarity, while quieter than closure, is often more powerful. Marcus spent years thinking peace came from avoiding conflict. Denise showed him peace comes from honesty, even when it costs you someone. And the real tragedy of silence isn't that it ends relationships, it's that it convinces us we're protecting them. Somewhere, someone listening is telling themselves they'll talk tomorrow, that tomorrow will come, that the moment isn't right yet. But tomorrow is a promise nobody can guarantee, and silence has a way of stretching until it becomes permanent. Marcus would tell you that if he could. He'd tell you that fear unspoken doesn't disappear. It chooses for you. And once it does, you don't get a vote in how things turn out. There's one last moment in this story, one final realization that didn't come from Marcus or Denise. It came from time itself, and it's the quiet truth that lingers long after everything else fades. Time is honest in a way people rarely are. It doesn't soften the truth. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how good your intentions were. It simply reveals what lasted and what didn't. Years later, when the urgency of pain had faded and life settled into something steady, Marcus noticed something unsettling. People rarely asked about Denise anymore. Not because she wasn't important, but because the story had already written itself. They saw her as capable, strong, settled. And Marcus? He was the footnote. Not the villain, not the hero, just the man who wasn't there when it counted most. That realization didn't come from bitterness. It came from observation. At school events, teachers spoke to Denise first. Doctors deferred to her automatically. Decisions were routed through her without question. Not out of disrespect, out of pattern. Presence creates authority. Silence forfeits it. Marcus understood that deeply now. He had given up his voice at the exact moment his presence mattered most, and no amount of later consistency could fully undo that. There was a strange humility in accepting that truth. Not everyone gets to rewrite their role. Some people only get to learn from it. Marcus stopped trying to reframe the past. He stopped saying, "if only," and "I wish." Those phrases didn't heal anything. Instead, he began to listen, really listen, to the stories around him. Friends confiding about marriages that felt empty. Coworkers joking about avoiding hard conversations. Men laughing off emotional distance as normal. Marcus heard himself in them. And sometimes, gently, he interrupted. Not loudly, just enough to plant a thought. Silence isn't neutral, he'd say. It lands somewhere. Some brushed it off, some grew quiet. A few asked questions. That's how change starts, not with lectures, with discomfort. Denise rarely spoke about the early years anymore, not because she had forgotten, but because that chapter no longer defined her. She had done the work of healing privately without needing Marcus's participation. That was the part that hurt him most. Not that she didn't forgive him, but that she didn't need him to heal. Independence born from necessity has a certain gravity to it. You can feel it when someone has learned to stand alone. Marcus respected that, and he learned from it. One evening, while helping his child with homework, Marcus noticed something small but meaningful. They didn't hesitate to ask for help. They didn't hide confusion or frustration. They spoke openly. That wasn't accidental. That was modeled. Denise had taught emotional language through action. Marcus had learned it through loss. Both lessons landed, but one cost more than the other. He realized then that cycles don't break on their own. Someone has to interrupt them, and Denise had done that when she chose stability over waiting. Marcus had joined later, not as the leader of change, but as a participant, and that was enough. Not ideal, but real. There's a temptation to frame stories like this with redemption as the centerpiece, to believe growth must come with restoration. But real life is rarely that neat. Sometimes growth comes with acceptance, with learning to live well even when the ending isn't what you hoped for. Marcus didn't regain the marriage. He gained wisdom. And wisdom, unlike regret, can be shared. The older Marcus got, the more he understood something simple and sobering. Silence doesn't just end relationships, it reshapes identities. It decides who leads, who follows, who carries weight alone, and who watches from a distance. If Marcus could speak to his younger self, he wouldn't yell, he wouldn't lecture. He'd just say one thing: speak while you still belong in the moment. Because once the moment passes, words lose their power. They become explanations instead of bridges. Denise never punished Marcus. She just moved forward. That's the part people misunderstand. Strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to wait. Marcus learned that the hard way. And if you're listening to this story and feeling unsettled, that's not an accident. Stories like this don't exist to entertain. They exist to mirror, to hold up a quiet truth and ask, where are you choosing silence right now? Who is carrying weight you haven't named? What moment are you assuming will come again? Because silence doesn't warn you before it costs you something. It just collects quietly. And by the time you notice, the price has already been paid. There's one final reflection left in this story. Not about regret, not about blame, but about the one thing silence can never give you back. There's one thing silence can never return to you: time. Not the clock kind, the lived kind, the kind measured in moments that only happen once. Marcus learned that lesson slowly, through accumulation rather than shock. He learned it when his child didn't remember the early years, not because they were traumatic, but because he wasn't there. He learned it when photos existed without him in them, when memories were told without his voice included, when family stories started with, "Your mom used to." Time doesn't hold space for absence, it just moves on. And silence, no matter how well intentioned, doesn't pause it. Marcus no longer tried to defend his younger self. He understood him: fearful, unprepared, quiet. But understanding doesn't equal justification. It just explains the wound. Denise, meanwhile, had stopped thinking of Marcus as someone who left. She thought of him as someone who arrived late. That distinction mattered, because late arrivals don't get to rearrange what's already settled. They adapt to what exists. And Marcus did. He respected boundaries. He honored Denise's leadership. He supported decisions without insisting on input he hadn't earned. That humility didn't come naturally. It was taught, by consequence. One afternoon, long after the hardest years had passed, Denise and Marcus found themselves laughing about something trivial. It surprised them both. Not because laughter was impossible, but because it no longer carried expectation. There was ease there. Not romance, not longing, just mutual respect. That's when Marcus understood something important. Not every ending needs to be tragic to be permanent. Some endings are quiet. They settle into place and become part of the landscape. You don't fight them, you learn to live around them. Denise had done that long ago. Marcus caught up eventually. If you're waiting for a moment in this story where Denise forgives Marcus in a dramatic speech, or where they reunite, this isn't that story. Life doesn't always reward growth with restoration. Sometimes it rewards growth with peace. And peace, while less exciting, lasts longer. Marcus became a different man than the one who left, not because he wanted to be redeemed, but because he didn't want to repeat himself. He learned to speak early, even when he didn't have answers. He learned that saying, "I'm afraid," builds more connection than saying nothing at all. He learned that showing up imperfectly beats disappearing politely. Those lessons didn't bring Denise back, but they shaped every relationship that followed, and that mattered. The final realization came quietly, like everything else in this story. One day, Marcus overheard his child explaining something to a friend. "My dad used to be really quiet," they said, "but now he talks." Marcus stood still, not because it hurt, but because it healed something he didn't know was still open. He hadn't erased the past, but he had changed the narrative going forward. That's all any of us can do. Denise once said something that stayed with Marcus. "Silence didn't break us," she said. "It showed me what I needed." That sentence reframed everything. Silence hadn't just caused loss, it had revealed truth. And truth, while painful, had guided better choices. This story isn't about blaming silence as if quiet itself is wrong. Quiet can be peaceful. Quiet can be healing. But silence used to avoid connection is something else entirely. It's a refusal to participate. And relationships cannot survive refusal. If there's one thing Marcus would want anyone listening to remember, it's this: you don't have to be ready to talk. You just have to be willing. Willing to stay in the room, willing to admit fear, willing to risk being seen. Silence feels safe because it asks nothing of you, but it also gives nothing back. And when it costs you time, it costs you something you can never earn again. There's one final moment left, one last truth that brings everything home. And it's not about Marcus. It's about you. If you've stayed with this story until now, it's probably because something in it felt familiar. Not identical, but close enough to stir something. Maybe you recognized Marcus. Maybe you recognized Denise. Maybe you recognized a version of yourself you don't talk about much. That's the quiet power of stories like this. They don't accuse, they invite reflection. Marcus's silence didn't come from cruelty. It came from fear, habit, and a lifetime of being taught that emotions were optional. And Denise's strength didn't come from bitterness. It came from realizing she couldn't afford to wait for someone else to choose her. Both of those truths exist at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. This is the part where stories usually offer advice. 5 steps, 3 rules, a neat conclusion. But life doesn't work like that. So instead, let this ending sit with you. Silence feels harmless in the moment. It feels calm, controlled, non-confrontational. But silence has consequences that don't announce themselves. It quietly teaches people how to live without you. It slowly removes you from moments you assumed were guaranteed. It convinces you there will be time later, until later becomes never. Marcus learned that silence doesn't protect relationships, it protects fear. And fear, when left unspoken, makes decisions for you. Denise learned that waiting for someone to show up can cost you yourself, so she chose stability over hope, not because she stopped loving, but because she started valuing presence. Their child learned something else entirely, that emotions can be named, that questions can be asked, that silence doesn't have to be inherited, and that may be the most important outcome of all. If you're listening right now and there's a conversation you've been avoiding, this story isn't telling you to be perfect, it's telling you to be present. Say the thing while it's still a bridge, not an explanation. Speak while the moment is still open. Because silence doesn't just close doors, it teaches people to stop waiting for them to open. Marcus would tell you that. Not loudly, just honestly. He'd tell you that regret doesn't come from saying the wrong thing, it comes from saying nothing at all. And Denise would tell you this, that strength isn't proven by how long you endure silence, it's proven by what you choose when silence makes you invisible. So if this story stirred something in you, don't rush to label it. Sit with it. Ask yourself, where have I been quiet instead of honest? Who has been carrying weight I never named? What moment am I assuming will come again? Because life rarely gives warnings. It just gives choices. And silence is always one of them. Choose carefully.
This story might feel close to your own life. Please listen till the end and share your thoughts in the comments. For more real stories like this, consider subscribing.